The noise as they stepped outside was quite indescribable for Sheeda. As it turned out, the tiny hut forming the entrance to the compound was isolated against sound a lot better than she would ever have expected, so as they opened the glass doors leading outside once again, the level of noise went from 0 to 100 really darn quickly. Huffing, snapping, snarling and barking filled the air, accompanied by the countless pitter-patters of many heavy paws crunching in the fluffy snow or bouncing across the frozen ground. Judging by the impact of the steps, it seemed like each of the beasts was at least as heavy as Sheeda, and it sounded like an entire horde of them had been set loose on the premises. As she came to find out soon after, that assessment wasn't all too far from the truth. Some paces behind the exit of the hut, a second fence separated the entrance area from the main premises, it seemed, although this one was much smaller than the highly secured one surrounding the entire area, and instead of chain link, it was built from a regular mesh of tiny metal bars that had been painted green. In a way, this thing was almost the prime example of human architecture, because not only was each segment of the fence formed like a rectangle, but the mess of tiny bars formed even more tiny rectangles over its entire surface. However, the fence itself wouldn't have been all that interesting to Sheeda if it hadn't been for the things that it contained from the outside world. Hairy, canine-looking beasts of a large variety of forms were prowling behind the metal mesh and produced the sounds that she heard as she stepped outside. Sheeda saw at least 10, but keeping accurate count was difficult with their erratic movements. While they were nowhere near as large as the massive Hirschbunnind she knew from her homeworld, each of them was still at least as large as Sheeda while standing up, and probably much heavier. Restlessly, the beasts patrolled the area behind the fence, pressing their size tightly against the metal mesh or jumping up to press their paws against the barricade, in a seeming attempt to tear it down with their weight. And all the while, they constantly yelped, squeaked, whined and barked, releasing an amazing cacophony of noise that pierced into Sheeda's sensitive ears, with the quick changes from high-pitched noises to deafening barks. Coco and Tuya, who had gone ahead earlier, seemed to form the epicenter of this storm of nervous energy, as the main bulk of the animals seemed to concentrate on staying close to the area of the fence, right where the two women stood on its other side. Tuya had taken a step back and watched the tornado of fur, teeth and drool from a respectful distance, while Coco had walked right up to what appeared to be a door in the fence, where she leaned down and seemingly stuck her fingers through the mesh, while quietly and excitedly cooing at the beasts in a high-pitched voice, once again speaking a language that Sheeda didn't understand. The beasts excitedly pressed their noses against the offered fingers, sniffing intently and sometimes even going so far as to lick or very gently nip at the appendages. Admittedly, Sheeda had worried for a second how easily one of the beasts could have taken the commander's fingers right off, without any of them having any chance to do something about it. However, as neither Coco herself nor any of the other humans appeared concerned about the display in the slightest, her worries quickly dwindled away, leaving mostly her discomfort with the noise and her personal unease about the proximity of the very obvious predators behind. As the group slowly caught up to the women, and also near the fence, Tuya looked back at them with an almost impressed expression. Akita, Marmalute, Leonberger, Ken Corso, all kinds of mastiff, wolfhounds and a wolf dog, she rattled off, and while Sheeda didn't exactly understand those words, the inflection made it seem like they were sort of names. Is there any large breed you don't have around here? In the meantime, James's face had absolutely lit up in delight, and was positively radiating now. His earlier worries seemingly pushed into the back of his mind for the time being. Not many places that can handle large dogs like these all too well, he explained as he walked over. And the second his voice had been heard, the already anxious energy of the animals behind the fence seemed to increase tenfold, as the noise picked up by another order of magnitude, and it now really seemed like some of them were almost desperately trying to find any way past the fence. We take them in, and once they're trained up, they're a great help with keeping everything in check around here. As he walked closer to the fence, Sheeda stopped for a moment, preferring to keep some distance from the beasts. With an understanding nod, James let go of her and walked towards the door. Putting a hand onto Coco's shoulder, he made the commander look up at him, and with an excited giggle, she made room. Was he just going to open that door? It didn't exactly help Sheeda's anxiety that Tuya appeared to be asking herself the exact same question, as she seemingly braced for a possible impact by one or more of the beasts, with her muscles noticeably tensing up. The canines still barked and snarled, and now all tried their best to push their mass into the tiny space right behind the door, forming a sort of bunched-up queue, and apparently getting ready to barrel right through the opening once it was created for them. However, as he lowered his hand onto the handle, James slowly released a long, drawn-out whistle that went from a very high-pitched tone at first to a more moderate one right after. For a moment, the beasts kept up their energetic snapping and snarling, drool dropping out of their chaps, as they could barely keep their mouths closed from excitement. James, however, didn't seem all too perturbed by that, as he simply repeated the same whistle a couple more times. And the more he did, the more the beasts seemed to calm down. Well, not quite. In reality, the beasts didn't appear to be any less excited than they had previously been. However, as more and more of them heeded the call of the whistle, they seemingly began to contain themselves. One after another, they made room behind the gate, spreading out across the area so there was a circle of at least a measure of space around each one, before lowering themselves to the ground and waiting. Their wait was all but patient. Even as they lay there, their tails were still wildly wagging through the air, and many of them still squealed and whined incessantly, while staring at the humans on the other side of the fence. However, they still waited. Admittedly, Sheeda's eyes opened a bit wider. These were animals, completely and utterly. Their eyes were attentive, but there was not a hint of sapient awareness behind them. But still, they listened to whatever command was hidden behind that whistle. There was no doubt that they still wanted to get at the humans with all their might, whatever primal instinct drove them still burning in their mind. But they restrained themselves, and they waited. And that at the command of a being entirely different from themselves. Somehow, like soldiers, these beasts had been trained, and they waited at attention much like a military group, awaiting the order of who they clearly somehow accepted as their superior. Only after every one of the beasts had settled onto the frozen ground did James press the handle of the door down and open it. Excitedly, some of the beasts twitched to move as it opened, with one even beginning to crawl and drag itself closer to the man without getting up, only stopping after James had given it a harsh look. But ultimately, they all waited, whining and squeaking and nervously licking at their chaps, but they waited. Stepping aside while holding onto the door, James made room for the group to pass him while forming a sort of guardian of this exit himself. Coco immediately hurried through, shortly followed by Tuya, who had waited for Nia to catch up to her first. Sheeta still hesitated for a moment. The anxious energy of the predators around her was infectious, and most of her more primal instincts told her that getting close to a large group of clearly nervous and excited carnivores was a bad idea for her own survival. However, she had to act according to her circumstances here. This was the humans' world, and if the humans weren't worried, there likely was no reason to worry. The ancient part of her mind yelling at her to not, under any circumstances, make it seem like she was running, Sheeta began to strut through the pack of prone predators. She didn't know if her nervousness was visible, but she was almost certain that the beasts could somehow smell it, as they watched her curiously. Luckily, most of them at least seemed to be a lot more distracted by the presence of some certain humans than they were by the presence of a literal alien, so that was something. After a few more steps, Sheeta briefly turned to see if James was catching up to her. However, despite closing it behind her, her boyfriend had opted to remain right at the door without moving, while everyone else had moved on a bit. Suddenly, there was a hand on Sheeta's shoulder. Turning her head, she saw Nia smile at her in a mixture of sympathy and amusement. "You'll probably want to make a bit more room," she said, and started to pull Sheeta a bit further, until they had left the bubble formed by the canines behind by a few measures. Tuya was also in this outskirt area, while Coco had remained a good bit closer to the main bulk of the pack. Nia then turned around to James, and the siblings made eye contact for a moment. For a second they nodded at each other. Then, James turned his gaze away, and let it glide across the beasts. It seemed they somehow knew what would be happening next, because many of their legs began to twitch, and they shimmied around, very obviously ready to jump to their feet at any moment, and seemingly anxious not to miss the exact timing to do so. James slightly crouched down, and it was clear that all of the canines wanted to charge right then and there. But they waited. Something unseen kept them tethered to their place on the ground, but only just. Then James lifted his hands. "All right," he announced, and brought his palms down onto his thighs with a loud clap. And with that simple command, he had kicked all hell loose. In the blink of an eye, every single one of the canines pounced to their feet, their heavy paws tearing chunks of grass out of the frozen ground, as they absolutely tore towards the man who stood in their centre. In a second, a tornado of fur was encircling James, and the choir of whines and barks re-emerged with a vengeance as they encircled James, who in turn crouched down even further, and seemingly did his best to rub his hands along the sides of whatever canine was currently in front of him, while also trying to somehow not be knocked off his feet by the massive animals jumping up at him. The whines soon turned to screams, as each animal tried its best to somehow become the focus of their master's attention, be it by jumping to press their paws against him, trying to lick at his face, or simply pushing all the others out of the way to get right in front of him. One of them, a sleek-looking animal with a grey-brownish coat and especially sharp yellow-green eyes, even went so far as to close its massive jaws completely around James's forearm, while releasing a deep, blood-curdling growl that sounded like it was getting ready to rip the flesh off the human's bones. However, James just laughed at that, and brought his other arm around to grab the beast by its muzzle, pulling it around by the head with gentle force. "Ooh, so scary," he sniggered in a baby voice, while the growls of the beast got more intense, forming an absurd contrast to the human's delighted demeanour. She'd began to see why James had as many scars as he did. In time, some of the beasts seemed to either have their fill of interaction, or were simply pushed out of the swirling circle of fur by their larger compatriots, and thus began to run around the general area, instead of tightly pressing themselves just into the tight space right around James. And as they did so, they seemed to either realise or remember that there were other people around as well. Soon, some of them were getting their apparently much-needed dose of attention and interaction from Coco, who was quickly swarmed by 3 of the large animals, and firmly ran her hand through the folded fur on their necks, while some more daring of the creatures moved to approach those who had deliberately taken distance from them. One of the largest ones, a burly one with almost golden fur that was so long that it was hard to tell where the beast ended and the coat began, charged at Nia, who just like her brother happily crouched down to greet the animal. Another grey one with curly hair, that stood taller than the other but appeared far less massive due to the lack of a thick coat, approached Tuya. Instead of crouching down like the other human, she stood tall in front of the canine. With a look of anticipation on her face, clearly not completely sure if what she did was going to work the way she intended, she curled her arms inwards and patted her flat hands against her shoulders. To her seeming delight, the animal immediately pushed its front paws off the ground. Standing up on 2 of its legs, it started to lean forwards with its front legs soon resting on Tuya's shoulders, while she ran her hands along the stretched-out body of the canine. "Good boy," she mumbled, while her fingers dug into the curly hair and scratched along the animal's skin. She too was using that strange, high-pitched baby tone that James and Coco had taken on earlier, which seemed a bit unfitting considering that the animal leaning against her easily dwarfed her in height now that it stood on 2 legs. Granted, she was the smallest one out of their group here, but the difference was substantial. Sheida had subconsciously begun to step back from the scene, seeing how willing these beings were to approach seemingly anything that walked on 2 legs. Her body more or less instinctively wanted to avoid close contact, like the one that was presented all around her. However, it obviously didn't take long until she, too, was spotted. Another titan of fur, this one with a very wide head, droopy ears and a fur coat that almost looked like a mane around his neck, stared at her with light brown eyes. Despite the fur once again making it hard to tell, she was quite sure that the canine was both bigger and heavier than her, as it trotted towards her with a springy step and wagging tail. Inadvertently, she made eye contact with it. The animal, having seemingly expected a similar reaction out of her like its conspecifics, had gotten out of the humans around them, slowed in its steps and seemed to study her. Feeling the large predator's gaze on her, trained or not, Sheida's own tail inadvertently began to swing through the air in a warning, while her ears turned attentively towards the beast. Its eyes following her waving tail for a second, the canine slowed even further, before finally coming to a complete stop about 2 measures away from her. Staring at her for a moment longer, it then released a loud huff and shook its entire head, but didn't approach any further, even going so far as to lay down on the ground again, this time without a command. Sheida tilted her head, and for a moment longer they just looked at each other, seemingly both not quite sure what to do with this being before them. Then, suddenly, another, much more energetic one of the canines quickly tore loose from the main bulk of the pack, and after a moment of seemingly aimlessly running in a circle on the spot, his eyes fell onto Sheida, who was the one figure not currently occupied by anything else. Quickly and excitedly, the very thin version of these canines, with equally thin fur and a very pointy face, ran in her direction, excitedly huffing and play-barking all the way. Subconsciously, Sheeta took an appreciative step backwards from the approaching animal, and tensed up in anticipation of a possible impact. However, before it could come to that, the first canine, that was still lying in its earlier position, suddenly jumped up from the ground and ran to the side, intercepting the charging one with a sideways tackle, while also snapping at the other's mouth. A brief scuffle ensued, during which the canines jumped at each other, and threateningly snapped at the air, while presenting their larger fangs. However, the maned dog had twice the mass of the thin one, and a winner was therefore quickly determined, as the thinner canine turned on the spot and ran back towards those that were still encircling James, while the burly one huffed in seeming satisfaction, before turning his brown eyes back onto Sheeta, and laying down on the spot again. Having watched herself apparently being defended, Sheeta's posture relaxed again. Well, I can appreciate that, she thought to herself, and suddenly made a step towards the brown bag of fur and muscle before her. The canine watched her closely as she approached, but otherwise remained completely relaxed. Once she had reached him, he simply rolled over, dropping all of his weight onto his side while widely exposing his stomach to her. Taking a page out of the human's book, Sheeta leaned down and ran her gloved hand through the exposed fur, figuring that was most likely what the creature wanted from her here. The panting of the animal seemed to get a bit more excited as she did so she figured she was probably doing something right here. The manic energy of the other beast still wasn't quite something that she wanted to get anywhere close to, but this one seemed to be alright. Having gotten this close now, she could see that there was a green collar around the canine's neck, with something shiny seemingly attached to it. Hesitating slightly, since it was so close to the predator's massive jaws, Sheeta reached for the glistening piece of metal that hung from the animal's neck. Balancing it on her fingertips, she saw that there were letters stamped onto it. Otto, it read. To Sheeta, that sounded like a name. She wondered if all these animals had names. What would an animal even do with a name? Otto, she tried saying it aloud, not quite sure if the way she said it sounded quite right. However, apparently she was close enough, because the animal attentively lifted its head, its eyes showing clear recognition of being addressed. Sheeta smiled lightly, and thinking about another beast's earlier excitement, she mumbled, "Good boy." Okay, enough. James finally laughed after allowing himself to be assaulted for a couple of minutes. Having been thoroughly nipped, pulled, licked and pawed all over at this point, he finally stood up to his full height. Some of the dogs took this as a challenge and began to jump up at him. However, they quickly backed off after he gave them the whistle, ordering to calm down. After almost a year away, he was at least as excited to see them as the dogs were to greet him again. However, they sadly didn't have all day. If they did, he would have just laid down right here and spent from now until sundown with nothing but cuddles, but that was not the world they lived in. After another whistle, the pack mostly dispersed, and although the dogs still oriented themselves around this group of visitors, they now left them a lot more personal space to move. Coco made a pouting face as her three companions ran off, but she'd have more than enough time to play with the dogs all she wanted later, so James's pity was quite limited. Swiftly, he moved to reconvene with everyone else. Awesome, Tia mumbled to herself with a chuckle, as she watched the dogs run large laps around them, to which Nia heartily giggled. I told you this place is amazing, Coco chimed in, as she too quickly ran over to the others. James's look soon settled on Sheeta. He had by no means expected her to like being surrounded by dogs, so her apprehensive reaction had not come unexpected. It did, however, definitely warm his heart seeing old Otto being so welcoming with her. Then again, the old Leonberger had more than enough experience in handling both anxious people and felines, so maybe he shouldn't be surprised. They can't come into our room, right? Sheeta quickly asked him as he approached, to which James awkwardly chuckled as he rubbed the back of his head. Not while you're around, I guess, he conceded, quickly admitting that it was most likely necessary for Sheeta to have a place to get away from the animals if she wanted, even if his room was usually open to the dogs at all times. They're pretty well trained, Tuya mentioned from the side. Yeah, and even better when they're not this excited, Nia confirmed for her, as they all finally regrouped. What are they? Sheeta chimed in, and Nia curiously turned in James's direction with a sideways glance. James smiled. We call them dogs. Humanity's greatest achievement, if you ask me, he replied, now putting his arm around her again. We domesticated them from other pack hunters we shared a habitat with many thousands of years ago. Ever since then, they've become near-perfect companions for us. I know they may not seem like all that, but believe me, when you get into the nitty-gritty, it's amazing just how adapted they really are to humans. He had to be careful not to get too excited at the topic, otherwise he might start to ramble. Sheeta nodded and looked around at the dogs in mild fascination, although there also seemed still to be a bit of a distance between her and the idea. Finally, she shook her head, as she stated, It's probably better for me if I just don't question it. However, then it seemed like she was thinking for a moment, before a bit of an idea seemed to come to her, and she added, So these are Domestimals, then? If you've had them for thousands of years, I guess that they don't count as wildlife anymore. James slightly froze up, and he began to chuckle nervously. Now there was a hard-to-explain topic. Admittedly, he had sort of suppressed the thought of it so far, but yeah. Ultimately, he doubted that the concept of Domestimals was familiar to many, if any, other species than humans. There certainly wasn't a term for it in the galactic uniform language, he knew that much. And given the galaxy's general disposition, that much was understandable as well. Not quite, he finally answered, after overcoming his internal resistance about possibly souring Sheeta's mood by an extreme amount once he began explaining. Or, I guess you could say that, technically. In a way, they are sort of the Domestimals, if you want. But no, the term doesn't really apply to them. Sheeta seemed to be cautiously curious, although she also very clearly picked up on his apprehension at the topic. Not that James was usually at all squeamish about talking about what he considered to be a not insubstantial mistake of humanity's past, but with Sheeta specifically, he wasn't quite as enthusiastic as usual when talking about it. So, what is a Domestimal then? She asked, her yellow eyes piercing into him with their curious glare. James sighed. It's probably easier if I just show you, he said. Since they wouldn't need the same lesson as the Offworlder did, he quickly instructed Nia to take everyone else on ahead already, while he made a quick detour with his girlfriend. Constantly surrounded by at least some of the dogs as they went, they walked along the sides of the compound, where soon large enclosures surrounded by thick fences emerged. Inside, all kinds of animals could be seen lounging around or trotting through the snow in the wide areas that they had at their disposal. Some of them even excitedly walked up to the fence, much like the dogs had done earlier, and they released attention-grabbing noises to try and get him to notice them. That is a big feline, Sheeta commented a bit under her breath, as a large tiger pounced up to the fencing, and the metal loudly clinked under the cat's weight, before it dropped down to all fours again. The tiger made an excited mooing sound, as James turned and presented the back of his knuckles to it, so it could pick up his scent, although he was obviously careful to keep his appendage out of the tiger's reach. Bengal tiger, James informed Sheeta, while the enormous cat sniffed his hand for a moment, before beginning to rub its massive head against the fence while releasing low chuffs. James smiled and repeated a scuffed version of the sound back at the animal, to which Sheeta chuckled. Now I at least know where you picked that up from, she commented, before producing a much more accurate reproduction of the sound, that sounded a lot lower than the natural chuff she herself made sometimes. The tiger looked up in seeming surprise at the accurate repetition of the sound of endearment, and his eyes locked with Sheeta's for a moment. The two striped felines slowly blinked at each other while keeping eye contact for a few moments. Then, carefully, Sheeta also reached her hand out, keeping it a bit further away from the fencing than James had, as she presented it to the mighty predator. The tiger chuffed again while sniffing at her gloves, and once again Sheeta repeated it back at the animal. Admittedly, James was a bit entranced by the exchange. Seeing this exchange between felines from completely different worlds, that had nonetheless evolved to remarkably similar, it was sheer unbelievable. This one's not a Domestimal, is it? Sheeta suddenly asked with a soft voice, pulling him out of his amazed trance. James shook his head to refocus. No, but she's a rescue and was raised by hand, so she's pretty tame, he explained briefly. You wouldn't be able to do this with a wild one. Indeed, the whole King of the Wilderness impression wasn't quite left by this big, fuzzy pushover that rubbed her thick head against the fence there. But she was still a wild animal, and this aloof demeanor could turn on a dime, even against him. Does she have a name too? Sheeta asked, and crouched down to be more on one level with her extremely distant, quadrupedal cousin. Yeah, James said, glad to see that there was at least interest on Sheeta's side. He had known that she would probably never love other animals quite as much as he did, but he had been a bit afraid that she would be totally apathetic. This interested sympathy on her part was already a huge relief. Her name is Nandita. She doesn't always listen to it, though. Nandita, Sheeta replied quietly, more to herself. Then she stood up again, looking at James expectantly. It seemed like she wanted to keep going. Not stopping for every animal coming up to the fence on their way, they then passed a few more enclosures, seeing a number of animals in passing that James would likely introduce to Sheeta later, on a complete and thorough tour of the premises. For now, they simply walked past them, until they reached a sort of fence border that separated two of the enclosures from each other, while still allowing the animals on either side to see and sort of interact with each other. Whistling through his teeth, James tried to call the not immediately reacting inhabitants out to him. They didn't come directly, as they weren't exactly the biggest fans of the cold. However, after a few tries, they luckily decided to still grace him with their appearance. In the enclosure on his right, a sleek, very thin feline emerged from a tiny heated hut. His fur was yellow with dark spots, and on his face, two tear streak-like lines ran from his eyes down to his muzzle. A beautiful cheetah. Then, on his left, much more enthusiastically, a very similar-looking animal approached him. It was just as thin as the cheetah, but walked slightly more upright in his posture. The spots on the fur were larger and formed a sort of marbled pattern. The telltale streaks were still on his face, but the eyes were much bigger, and so was the nose. The ears, too, were a good bit larger than on the counterpart, and instead of being rounded, they ended in slight points. Most importantly, however, were the loud meowing noises it made as it approached him, greeting him with an almost needy tone. A Texan June cat. Named like that because whoever first bred these animals apparently thought that cheetahs lived in the desert, which was already telling you the kind of caliber of people you were dealing with there. That one's the Domestimal, Sheeta said with certainty, and pointed at the June cat, despite having never seen either of these animals before. James could only nod. Correct, he said. This is Chrissy. He ran his hand along the mesh of the fence, and the June cat excitedly pressed her head against it, while loudly meowing. And the other one's Ayana, he added, with a gesture towards the cheetah. Technically, they're the same species. Sheeta crouched down slightly to look at the cats more closely. Well, if all the dogs were the same species, I can believe it, she mumbled, although she still sounded somewhat doubtful at the claim. Inadvertently, she was on the right trace. Yeah, much like dogs, June cats like this one here have been bred for domestication, James explained, as Chrissy began to lick across the backs of his fingers, her rough tongue scratching up his dry skin in the cold air. However, unlike dogs, that didn't happen over thousands of years. He then pulled his hand back and waited for Sheeta to look at him, as she waited for an explanation. Steeling himself, he took a deep breath. You already heard about the war against Michael, and how it shook up basically the entirety of Earth. Nations broke apart and merged with each other. Cultures shifted all around the world. It was chaos, he explained slowly, while his eyes stuck to Sheeta's face. And shortly after, there was a bit of a free-for-all period when it came to what could and couldn't be done. New technologies exploded and quickly became widely available to everyone, after they had been declassified during the newly emerging time of peace. Meanwhile, the newly established governments couldn't quite keep up with the regulation of all of them, meaning that for a couple of years there was a period where a lot of things happened in a way that they probably shouldn't have. Among them, a lot of very amateurish genetic engineering. He turned away for a moment, looking back at the June cat. They were still waiting for him to once again present his hand to it, so it could continue its affectionate licking. You know, domesticating animals isn't easy. It takes a lot of time, and you can't do it with every animal. Certain conditions have to be there naturally, otherwise you can try as much as you want and you'll never get serious results. He continued his explanation. Well, some people decided that they wanted to try anyway, but they didn't want to do it the slow and hard way. Quick and easy was the idea, and if there were no natural traits to enhance to get the wanted result, then they would simply add them in. It's hard to say what exactly makes an animal domesticated genetically, but we can somewhat pin it down. And since we can, some people tried to add those features into other animals they wanted to somehow make into pets, because I guess the yearnings of their hearts were bigger than the warnings of their minds. The results are what we call Domestimals. Sheeta seemingly wanted to comment on that, but James quickly raised his hand to indicate for her to wait. He wasn't quite done yet, because that was only half the story. However, remember how I said dogs are near-perfect companions? Yeah, well, Domestimals are not that. Because the people who created them, in my expert opinion, had no fucking idea what they were doing. With the way they integrated these new traits, it ended in a sort of halfway result. Yes, Domestimals can be like pets. They react generally positive to humans, and have a certain drive to please, meaning they can be trained. However, that is a big can. I can train them because I know what I'm doing. Flynn can train them, and he's been doing it for years. But some random Joe Schmo you pick up on the streets? Yeah, he's going to struggle. These animals have absolutely no fear of humans, and the solitary mindset of their ancestors still remains in their head, even if it is now joined by some new features, and they switch between the two on a dime. Add to that most of them are quite a bit more dangerous than your average lapdog or house cat, and you have a disaster waiting to happen once they become readily available in the pet trade. He finished his story with a sigh. The injuries are uncountable, and deaths aren't exactly uncommon. These days, the practice of creating Domestimals is outlawed, no matter how much less amateurish geneticists became over the years. And now, places like this compound exist to take those Domestimals that have become a danger to people in, and rehabilitate them. Although, around here, rehabilitating basically just means keeping them around, because handing them off into private hands is illegal around these parts. Sheeta blinked slowly after he had finished his explanation, and her gaze briefly darted over to the June cat again, apparently seeing the animal with entirely new eyes now. The cat was still crying out for attention, and now began pawing at the mesh in order to maybe garner some affection from the bipeds that had caught it out into the cold. But if they're illegal to own and create, why are they still around today? She asked, with a bit of a confused gaze, apparently swallowing several much more burning questions she had for James's benefit. James sighed once again. This time a bit of annoyance snuck in there as well. Not at Sheeta, but at the world. It's not illegal everywhere, he said, closing his eyes shut for a moment so he wouldn't slip into anger. Creating new ones is, but breeding the ones that are already there is still a widely performed practice in big parts of the world. And those parts are extremely stubborn about it. Many people are extremely attached to these animals, and want to keep them around as pets, despite how bad of an idea that generally is. And when there's a demand, there will be plenty of people following the money, and providing a supply. And every now and then, some of the animals from those areas get smuggled into the country, which then in turn end up here. Sheeta let out a much-saying exhale. Guess not everything about humans is unfamiliar, she mused, likely reminiscing about other damages greed had caused on other worlds over the years. All things considered, she was taking this remarkably well. Maybe she had just spent enough time around James at this point that talk of genetic modification didn't bother her all that much anymore. Finally, she reached out her hand at the incessantly meowing cat, which immediately began to rub its head against the fence and her fingers, while loudly purring at even this modicum of attention it got. Her voice then turned a bit softer, as she added, "At least there's someone to take care of them."